It's appropriate, as we are here right on the eve of the Feast of Tabernacles, it's appropriate that we stop and consider various things. We see in the world around us a tremendous amount of unrest that is going on, and a lot of things that certainly should sober us and make us realize that we are living in very momentous times. This is the third consecutive festival season that has seen tremendous events going on in Europe. Tremendous events going on in Europe. And 2 years ago at the feast, right prior to the festival season, at that time, all of Eastern Europe was under the communist boot. All of those nations were behind what was called the Iron Curtain. And there had begun to be strife and unrest in Poland. Now, that strife and unrest in Poland went back to the fact that a Polish pope had been selected several years earlier. And that began to stir the Polish people and all of the Eastern European peoples from a slumber, a sort of just acceptance of what they viewed as the inevitable. And that was a major factor. I think we sometimes, our secular media in the United States overlooks that. But to the Europeans, to the people of Poland and other of the nations, the Catholic nations behind the Iron Curtain, because they were nations that were very heavily Catholic, the selection of the first non-Italian pope in about 500 years, and the selection of the first pope ever from Poland, was taken by those people as a sign from heaven that God had not forgotten them, that He had remembered them. This was the way it was stated at the time, and that set the stage for the beginning of the labor unrest and the agitation, because you see, the one thing people have to have if they're going to set out to achieve or accomplish anything, the one thing people have to have is hope. When you deprive someone of hope, all of the will goes away and they just simply give up. This can be the case in prisoners of war camp. It was the case in the aftermath of World War II. The few times that any hope flickered, Russian troops were very quick to come in and to put it down. In 1956, there were hopes that flickered in Hungary, and there was an uprising in Hungary, and very quickly Russian troops crossed the border, Russian tanks rolled into Budapest, and there was very quickly an end put to any idea that communist government was optional. 12 years later, in 1968, the same thing took place in Czechoslovakia, the so-called Prague Spring. And that, again, resulted in the invasion of Russian troops and the reinstitution of hardline communist government. So the circumstances were such that people had lost hope. Anytime hope glimmered, the iron fist was smashed down and hope was extinguished. But the stage was set with the election of a Polish pope that set the stage for a series of events that right now is continuing to unfold. We can easily take some of these things for granted, because even though they have taken place very quickly, yet they have also been spread over a period of several years. But events have propelled along, and beginning 2 years ago, right prior to the feast, labor unrest in Poland, which of course had greatly been encouraged and masterminded by Pope John Paul, He was in very direct communication with the leaders of the Polish movement that led finally to a compromise on the part of the communist government, and then it was like the dam had burst. Because once Poland was able to do it and Russian troops didn't pour in, then boom, 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 all of the other nations across Eastern Europe, it spread and spread and spread. Spread into Czechoslovakia, it spread even into Bulgaria, and it spread into East Germany. It spread into Hungary. And these nations, the circumstances just rolled so rapidly that it was absolutely incredible. Just 2 years ago. And the division between East and West Germany was breached. And there was a pouring across of people. Last year, during the feast, it was during the feast that, beginning of the feast, that German reunification officially took place. Long, long before anybody had ever predicted it a year earlier. You know, if you'd watched the news programs a year earlier during the feast, when the Berlin Wall was first breached and people first began coming across, they were saying, well, this doesn't mean Germany's going to reunite, and if it does, well, it's going to be... So this great feast that occurred in chapter 8, verses 65 and 66, that it describes these particular events. And this is the account of the sacrifice and of the dedication of the temple. And a parallel account is given back in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And but here we find that in Solomon's reign, in itself a type of the millennium, we find the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, representing what should have been the beginning of the increase of God's government spreading out. But you see, when prosperity and abundance, when celebration is separated from obedience, when celebration and rejoicing is separated from obedience, the celebration soon comes to an end. The celebration is headed down a one-way street when it's separated from obedience. There was a time of great abundance. There was a time of great peace and prosperity. There was a time of celebration. And the Feast of Tabernacles that was celebrated here was a very festive time. Solomon even provided the animals to double the length of the feast. You ever been at the feast and had such a great time you didn't want to go home? Well, you know, Solomon's feast here at the dedication of the temple, he doubled the length of the feast. He just provided the extra livestock and things out of his own stores to just let people have the feast, double the length out. But there was a problem. You see, Solomon inclined his heart after other gods. Solomon got away from focusing on God. He turned his heart away from God's law. And as a result, the less he looked to the law, the less he looked, the more he lost his understanding. In 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1, we're told that King Solomon loved many strange women. Nations that God had told the Israelites not to intermarry with. Solomon didn't pay any attention to that. And we're told in verse 4 that when he was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect, not complete and sincere with eternal his God, as was the heart of David his father. And after a while, he began making compromises and going after various gods and goddesses, doing evil in the sight of the eternal, allowing idols' temples to be built, and problems began to come. Adversaries, in verse 14, were stirred up against Solomon. Difficulties and trouble. You see, there is a progression. When we hear the law, we're listening to the law. We're taking it in and learning it. And it is changing the way we think. We're coming to become more deeply impressed with God. That leads to obedience, which leads to blessings. But you see what happened? Solomon began a process of compromise. He began to become more impressed with the world around him than he was with God. And his mind got off the law of God and on to what everybody else was doing. He began to think less and less about God's law. And he began to be more and more concerned about all of these interesting things that were happening around him. And he was more attracted to that. And he began to make compromises. You know, he didn't get up from praying that prayer in 1 Kings 8 the next morning and go out and build an idol's temple. It was a process that took place over a few years. Solomon peaked, and he began going down, because his heart did not continue to incline toward God's law. And therefore, God became less real to him. He became more impressed with the world around and more desiring to please all of these wives he had than he was to please God. And it led the entire nation off track. So there's a vital point that we have to take note of. Now let's turn back to the book of Zechariah, chapter 14. And let's begin to put some of this together. Chapter 14 of Zechariah, we're told that the day of the eternal comes. All nations will be gathered against Jerusalem to battle. In verse 3, then the eternal will go forth, and his feet shall stand in that day on the Mount of Olives, and the mount shall be cleaved in two. And all of the saints shall be with him. End of verse 5. So here we have the fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets, the return of Jesus Christ. Living waters will spring forth, verse 8. Verse 9, the eternal shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord, and his name one. Verse 11, men shall dwell in it, and there shall be no more utter destruction. Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Then we're told in verse 16, it'll come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Eternal of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that those that will not come up of all the families of the earth, there won't get any rain. And if Egypt doesn't come up, when they don't get rain, then there will be a plague, wherewith the Eternal shall smite the nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. In that day there shall be upon the bells of the horses holiness unto the Eternal. And the pots in the Eternal's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. It's going to be a time of unifying the whole world. We live in a world that is becoming increasingly balkanized, right in the Balkans and all over the world. Dividing and splitting and splintering. A world that has lost the basis. People don't have anything to unify them and to hold them together. And what appears to unify and hold them together, or what has, were things that never produced peace and prosperity and security and happiness. You see, what does everyone want all over the world? What do the people in Eastern Europe want? What do the people in Central and South America want? What do people throughout this nation want? What do people in Asia and Africa and all over the world want? They want what God is going to bring, and what can only come at that time. They want what none of the great would-be messiahs that has arisen have ever been able to provide. Hitler didn't provide it. He promised the German people a 1,000-year right. He didn't give them a 1,000-year right. He plunged them into 6 years of the most hellish war that the world had ever known. It ended with the complete destruction of the nation. Stalin, the communists, promised a workers' paradise. And it was so much of a paradise they had to build walls around it and put guards on the walls to shoot everybody who was trying to get out. Some paradise. You know, that's quite a paradise when you have to build... You know, if it was paradise, they would have built a wall around it to keep everybody else from breaking in. They didn't build a wall around it to keep everybody else from breaking in. They built a wall around it to keep everybody in paradise from breaking out. You know, what a travesty. What a tragedy. What a betrayal of hope. But that's just one more part of the story that over and over and over again down through the centuries, man has been misled and has gone charging off following false messiahs who promised what people wanted. But none of them have delivered. None of them have delivered. People want peace. You know, the time's going to come. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Every man will sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and none will make him afraid. That's peace and security. They want prosperity. Isaiah says that the Lord will make unto all nations a feast of fat things. A feast of fat things, full of marrow, of wines on the lees, well refined. A feast of fat things unto all the world. No more starvation, no more hunger, but a feast of fat things to the whole world. That's prosperity. That's abundance. That's what the world doesn't have and desires. Time of freedom. Oh, the whole world will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. What the world is waiting on, what the world is desiring, what the world has followed false messiahs who have failed to deliver, are the things we're celebrating. The world will ultimately have it when the whole world does what? When they're coming up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles from year to year. Because when they're coming up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, they're going to be hearing the law of God. They're going to hear the law of God so that they might learn and inculcate God's law, His statutes, His judgments. They're going to hear and learn the law of God so that they might learn to fear the eternal God. That they might learn to stand in awe of and to be deeply impressed with God, because that will result in obedience. That will result in blessing. God tells us that we're to go to the Feast of Tabernacles that we may learn to fear Him and that we may rejoice before Him, us and all of our household. It's a time of giving, a time of sharing. But first and foremost, if our feast is going to be a successful feast, it's got to be a spiritual feast. Yes, have a good feast physically. Certainly be careful, and we don't want to overdo it because that can undermine the enjoyment of the feast. But have a good feast spiritually. Go there, asking God to help you come away from this feast more deeply impressed with Him than ever before. Seek to put His law into action in your life, giving and sharing and helping and encouraging others. Seek to learn God's laws and God's ways more deeply, to come away with them more deeply embedded within your heart and your mind, because we're setting the stage and preparing for a time when we're going to share this with the whole world. And brethren, the world we're living in so deeply, deeply needs what we have to share. We can look forward to the time when the whole world will come to appear before the Eternal of Hosts to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles.